Hello and Happy New Year. It's good to be back after a short break over Christmas spent with family and, supposedly, having some downtime. Even so, I found myself thinking about the podcast and what would make sense as the first episode of the year. My name is Guy Burton and I'm the creator and host of 10 Minutes On. This podcast doesn't aim to break news. Instead, it looks at the stories behind the headlines, offering context and analysis, drawing on my background as an academic, educator and researcher. So before getting started, a quick note. If you find the podcast useful, I'd be grateful if you would like, share, review, and subscribe. New episodes come out every Tuesday morning, and you can find me on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, or via my website at guyburton.net. So let me set the scene. When I was thinking about what to cover this week, my initial plan was to look at Donald Trump in his first year back in office, and to connect that to work I did about a decade ago with Ted Goertzel. That work eventually became a book called Presidential Leadership in the Americas Since Independence. But events quickly overtook that plan. In the early hours of January the 2nd, leading into the 3rd, the United States launched a land, sea, and air operation against Venezuela. US jets disabled Venezuelan air defenses and struck the Fuerte Tiuna military complex in Caracas, where President Nicolás Maduro and his wife were sheltering. American troops entered the compound, extracted Maduro, and flew him to New York, where he now faces charges related to drug trafficking, cartel leadership, and cooperation with designated terrorist organizations, including Colombia's FARC. That episode is the immediate focus of this discussion, but it also opens up much wider questions, which I'll come to shortly. So, the immediate reactions. The initial international reaction has been mixed, though condemnation has been widespread. Whether one regards Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate president, and I don't, given that opposition candidate Edmundo González won around 70% of the vote in the 2024 election, there is still something profoundly unsettling about foreign troops seizing a sitting head of state. The most obvious historical comparison is Panama in 1989, when the United States invaded and eventually detained General Manuel Noriega, who was later tried and convicted in the US on drug charges. But even that parallel only goes so far. As a foreign policy article by the Panamanian diplomat Carlos Ruiz Hernandez noted back in November, the United States already had around 13,000 troops stationed in Panama at the time, under agreements related to the Panama Canal. American forces had deep local knowledge and, crucially, a plan for what would follow. The opposition leadership was integrated into US planning early on, and political succession was secured before Noriega's arrest. Venezuela was very different. The operation left the country effectively leaderless. President Trump initially claimed that the United States would run Venezuela. In practice, though, Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, has assumed power, though the transition has been anything but smooth. Washington has since threatened further strikes if Rodriguez fails to comply with US demands, despite the fact that she comes from the same political movement as Maduro. And regionally, leaders such as Lula da Silva in Brazil, Gustavo Petro in Colombia, and Mexico's president have been sharply critical. By contrast, leaders aligned with Trump, such as Javier Milei in Argentina and Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, have been far more approving. Russia and China have condemned the operation. Europe, meanwhile, has tried to hedge, reluctant to criticize the United States directly, while quietly welcoming the removal of a leader many regarded as illegitimate. But the most interesting issue here is not diplomatic reaction. The more interesting and more troubling question is what this episode tells us about the state of the international order itself. This is not the first time the United States has removed or undermined foreign leaders. It's done so in Iran in the 1950s, Chile and Brazil in the 1960s and 1970s, Iraq in 2003, as well as the case of Panama back in 1989. The action in Venezuela also comes 6 years to the day after the US drone strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. What makes Venezuela different is the abduction of a sitting president, an act that openly challenges diplomatic immunity and raises fundamental questions about whether international law still constrains powerful states. Even the Iraq War, for all its flaws, was framed, however disingenuously, as legally and morally justified. In Venezuela, there was no serious attempt at international or domestic legitimation. Congressional committees were not meaningfully consulted. The action was unilateral and explicit. So that raises an uncomfortable question. If this is now acceptable behavior, what stops others from doing the same? China and Taiwan are the most obvious concern. Russia and the Baltics perhaps as well, but less so, because Russia is already bogged down in Ukraine. But the precedent still matters. And that brings us to the broader structural issues at stake. In recent years, it has become fashionable to argue that growing US-China rivalry is pushing the world towards a new Cold War. But that analogy may be misleading. While there is increasing multipolarity at the regional levels around the world, China still lacks the global reach of the United States, and American power itself is increasingly constrained. As the experiences of Afghanistan and Iraq, and perhaps now Venezuela will show, it is relatively easy to dismantle existing arrangements, but building something new in their place and consolidating it is far harder. And this is a point echoed by several Chinese analysts. Wang Fan of China Foreign Affairs University has argued that China does not seek to overthrow the international order, but to reform it. And that position is actually quite revealing, not least because it recognizes both the costs of systemic rupture and the absence of any ready-made alternative. And it also raises a further question. What exactly is left to reform if the United States itself is dismantling the system it once led? Zhou Bo, a senior fellow at Tsinghua University's Center for International Security and Strategy, takes the argument further. He suggests that the conditions which allowed the great powers to design a new international order after the Second World War, at Yalta and elsewhere, no longer exist. In today's environment, modern great power competition and deep structural fragmentation place firm limits on grand strategic bargains and large-scale binding agreements to divide global influence. So taken together, these views point to a sobering conclusion. The international system may not be in a transition at all. Fracture itself may be the enduring condition here. And this leads us to another, often overlooked point. Much analysis still treats the international order as something imposed by the United States and resisted by others. What is striking about recent American behavior, especially under Trump's second administration, is that the order is now being dismantled from within. The recent US national security document that came out last month openly questions alliances with Europe and undermines long-standing assumptions underpinning NATO. The very state that constructed the post-1945 order increasingly appears to be walking away from it, without offering a clear alternative. The criticism so often directed at Russia and China that they undermine existing arrangements without proposing a replacement now applies, at least in part, to Washington itself. And this brings me back to the work I mentioned earlier, published about a decade ago with Ted Goertzel, where he examined presidential leadership across the Americas using a framework developed by the political scientist Stephen Skoronek. Skoronek argued that presidents tend to fall into four broad types: reconstructive presidents, who build new political regimes; articulative presidents, who consolidate existing ones; preemptive presidents, who challenge a system but fail to replace it; and disjunctive presidents, who cling to a declining order. When we published that book, just before Trump's first term, we had no clear sense of where he would fit in. Now, though, it seems increasingly plausible that Trump is a reconstructive figure of a very particular kind. Not because he has built a new order, but because he is actively dismantling the old one, while giving political expression to the forces that have turned against it. The problem, of course, is that nothing coherent has emerged to take its place. If there is a new order taking shape, it may simply be disorder. A world in which rules are conditional, power is transactional, and precedent no longer places meaningful limits on behavior. And this is why all of this matters. A system based or built on short-term deals and unilateral actions is ill-suited to long-term challenges such as climate change, nuclear proliferation, or collective security. It encourages states to maximize their own security at others' expense, fueling mistrust and arms races. And so that what we end up with is management rather than governance, permanent crisis control in a system where there is no shared horizon. So while the invasion of Venezuela has been described as unprecedented or exceptional, it may be neither, and it may not be the United States alone that acts this way in the future. That is the thought I wanted to leave on the table today. As ever, thank you for listening. If you found this episode useful, please like, share, and review the podcast. It really does help with visibility on platforms like Spotify and Apple. I'd also welcome your feedback and suggestions for future topics. I already have a few episodes planned around upcoming elections, but I'm always open to new ideas. And finally, while I enjoy producing this work, I'm also open to new professional opportunities this year. So if you think my skills or experience might be useful to individuals or organizations you know, I'd be grateful for an introduction. So thank you again for listening, and I'll speak to you again next Tuesday. Have a good week, and goodbye.